始讲说，我还没有拿到博士学位，我只有 Master， 没有博士。如果财经要给我博士学位的话，当然很欢迎。可是我还没有拿到博士。Sorry, I have to change my language to English here. Because if I use Chinese, I will never be able to cover all the topics that I want to cover this afternoon. We live in a very strange world. Very, very strange world. Interest rates are zero in so many parts of the world. And in parts of Europe, it's now negative. What does negative interest rates mean in a capitalist system? Capitalist system is supposed to value capital. If the capital has a negative interest rates, we are completely outside our textbooks. And there's so much money pushed into the financial markets in the United States, in Japan, in Europe, in the UK. None of these countries have any inflation. If anything, they are worried about deflation, not inflation. This also put us completely outside what we know as textbook economics. And I'd like to go over some of the charts so that you know why these things are happening and why we have to think very differently to understand what's happening around the world. This chart shows three monetary aggregates. I probably used it 2 years ago on the same hall. This is monetary base, how much liquidity the central bank pump into the system. And central bank can pump in any amount of liquidity it wants. That's under the control of the central bank. This one shows the money supply, how much money we actually get to spend. That's all our bank deposits put together. And the green line is how much credit, how much private sector borrow from the banks. And we learn in economics that all three are supposed to move together. Right? If the central bank increases monetary base by 10%, eventually money supply and credit growing by 10%. And that world did exist before the Lehman shock. Three lines moving together. But after that, all over the map, Federal Reserve increased it from 100 to 450, 465. But money supply only grew to 155, credit only 113. Why is this credit important? It's very important because central banks can always add liquidity into the system, but for the liquidity to come out of the banks to the real economy, banks cannot give away money. It has to lend money. And this is how much money they actually lend. That means only 13% increase over a 7-year period, which is nothing. Which means all that money injected into the banking system, they are in the financial market, but not in the real economy. As a result, no pickup in inflation. So all this money the central bank put in are still in the financial system, not actually entering the real economy. And that's also true in Europe. This is a European situation. Three lines moving together, as we learn in universities. But after European Central Bank did all sorts of monetary easing, this is the credit to the private sector. 98 means 2% below where they were 7 years ago. No wonder European economies are doing so poorly and inflation rate is coming down. This is the UK. Same story. Three lines moving beautifully together, and then UK did one of the largest quantitative easing in history, 491. But if you look at the credit to the private sector, only 81. 19% below where they were 7 years ago. And even the UK economy is doing very well, that's mostly from the money coming from outside the UK. Because inside the UK, money is not really circulating, which is why inflation went almost to zero, and we actually have a number of negative inflation numbers in the UK recently. That's the world Japan experienced all over this last 25 years. This is a Japanese chart going all the way back to the time of the bubble. So this is when the bubble began, 1985. 1985 to 1990, we had a bubble. And then the three lines began to diverge. the tremendous pressure put on Bank of Japan to ease monetary policy, so they did the first quantitative easing in history here. But credit to the private sector actually kept on shrinking, and Mr. Kuroda came in and tried again, a huge one. But when you look at the credit to the private sector, still almost no growth. And as a result, after initial excitement, inflation is back to zero again. And if you look at it more closely, this is the most recent part of Japan. This is Governor Shirakawa of Bank of Japan. This is Mr. Kuroda. And Kuroda did increase this very rapidly compared to Mr. Shirakawa's period. But when you look at this line, it's almost a complete straight line. No pickup in demand for funds, no pickup in inflation. Why do we get this kind of decoupling? Well, if I compare this with China, you can see how bad the decoupling was. This is the China's three lines. And if you look at China, this is starting from year 2000 all the way up to here. This is exactly like the textbooks. Central bank increase money supply, credit to the private sector, liquidity, money supply, credit to the private sector also increasing, just as we learn in economic textbooks. So China is not suffering the kind of problems that these developed economies are suffering. And this is how the Taiwan ones look like. In the Taiwan situation, I made this one, August 2008 100. And then you see that after the GFC, it fell a little bit, but it is still growing again. And same thing happens during the IT bubble. It fell again, but then started growing. So Taiwan is not in that category also. Much closer to a Chinese situation than to the Western situation, in that it is still growing. The credit demand is still growing, which I think is a good news, not a bad news. But why are these other countries having so much problems? Well, it's the bursting of the bubble. During the bubble period, people borrow lots of money to invest in all sorts of assets. And when the bubble bursts, what happens? Asset prices collapse, but the liabilities remain. And they realize that, they're actually bankrupt. Because assets are here, liabilities are here. So they stop trying to repair their balance sheets by paying down debt. And if you are bankrupt, no matter how low the interest rates go, you are not going to borrow money. You have to pay back your debt as quickly as possible. And no banks will lend you money either, especially if the bankers know that you're actually bankrupt. That means the private sector is no longer maximizing profits, they are minimizing debt. But all the economics we learn in universities are based on the assumption the private sector is maximizing profits. So we have to think completely outside the box to understand this world, this economy, these economies. And this chart shows what happened to US house prices and the Japanese house prices 15 years earlier in Tokyo and Osaka areas. And you can see that both on the way up, on the way down, they moved remarkably similar. So what happened in the United States is exactly the same as what happened in Japan 15 years earlier. Although there are some differences here, and if I have time, I'll explain why the two began to diverge. And this is what happened in Europe. Europe had a huge housing bubble as well. In fact, the European housing bubbles, in some sense, were bigger than the housing bubble in the United States. If we take 1995 as 100, Irish prices went to 514, Greek prices 342, Spanish 303, even Netherlands 276. Huge housing bubbles. And they all collapsed. Now what happens when the bubble collapses? Everybody's repairing balance sheets, paying down debt. That's the right thing to do. If I'm in that situation, I'll be doing the same thing. But when everybody does it all at the same time, we enter a massive fallacy of composition problems. Because in a national economy, if someone is saving money or paying down debt, you better have someone on the other side borrowing and spending money. And in the usual world, it's people like us in the financial sector, myself, or some of you, the banks. The financial sector take the money from the savers, give it to someone who can use it, And if there are too many borrowers, interest rates are raised. Too few borrowers, interest rates are lowered. Make sure all the saved funds are borrowed and spent. That's how the economy operates. But when the bubble bursts, when you're in this situation, and when so many borrowers have balance sheets underwater, you bring interest rates down to zero, there will be no borrowers. Everybody's still paying down debt. Then what happens? All the money that comes into the financial sector cannot leave the financial sector because there are no borrowers even at zero interest rates. And if you don't do anything about the situation, the economy will start collapsing very, very rapidly. If I give you a numerical example, if I have $1,000 of income and I spend $900 myself, $900 is already someone else's income, so that's not a problem. The $100 that I decide to save will go through the banks, give it to someone who can use it, that person borrows and spends it, and then total expenditure in the economy will be $900 that I spent, $100 that this person spent, $1,000 against the original income of $1,000, and the economy can move forward. But what happens in a situation like this? I have $1,000 of income, I spend $900 myself. The $900 is already someone else's income, so that's not a problem. But the $100 that I decide to save will come into the financial sector, but it cannot leave the financial sector because even at zero interest rates, there are no borrowers. Then the total expenditure of the economy has already shrunk from 1,000 to 900. The 900 is someone's income. If that person says, okay, let's save 10%, spend 810 and save $90, the $90 gets stuck in the financial system also because this kind of thing takes a long time to repair. So economy can go from 1,000, 900, 810, 730 very, very quickly before the whole thing collapsed. And we actually had that situation during 1929 to 1933. That's when the US had a Great Depression. US Great Depression was that kind of recession. Sorry, this is not the Great Depression. US, until 1929, all these people were borrowing money in the United States. And when the bubble burst in October 1929 in New York, everybody started paying down debt all at the same time. Nobody is borrowing money from the other side. And then the whole thing collapsed. The United States lost 46% of its GDP in just 4 years, from 1929 to 1933. Now, this is the Japanese situation. What happened to Japan? During the bubble days, this is how much money Japanese companies borrowed from capital markets, from the banks. And during the bubble days, as you can see, they borrowed so much, investing in all sorts of assets. And interest rates, Bank of Japan tried to cool the situation down by raising interest rates. When the bubble burst, you can see the demand for funds falling very, very sharply. Bank of Japan, realizing that the economy is beginning to collapse, brought rates down from 8% almost to zero by 1995. And look what happens here. Demand for funds actually goes into negative. Negative means the entire corporate sector in Japan is paying down debt at zero interest rates. We never learned this in economics, right? Companies are not supposed to pay down debt at zero interest rates. They're supposed to be borrowing money at zero interest rates. So this thing lasted for full 10 years. It took 10 years to clean Japanese balance sheets, or repair Japanese balance sheets. Now, by 2005, Japanese corporate balance sheets were repaired. So they were beginning to borrow money, and then the Lehman Brothers collapsed. Japanese knew exactly what's going to happen to the rest of the world because they went through it all, went onto the defensive again, and we are around here now. If you look at how much money was paid down debt here, it's over 30 trillion Japanese yen per year. That's 6% of Japan's GDP. And that's just corporate debt repayment, 6% of Japan's GDP. On top of that, Japanese households were also saving money. If that was 4% of GDP, and companies were paying down 6% of GDP in terms of debt repayment, then Japan could have lost 10% of GDP here, just like the Great Depression in the United States from 1929 to 1933. Then you look at the Japanese GDP. This is the Japanese GDP those two lines, both in nominal and real terms. And you notice that this is where the bubble burst. This is what happened to Japan's commercial real estate. Japanese GDP never fell below the peak of the bubble. Always above the peak of the bubble. This is the peak of the bubble. Instead of falling like the United States, 1929 to 1933, Japanese GDP was always above the peak of the bubble. Why was that possible? Japanese real estate prices, the commercial real estate prices, actually fell 87% nationwide. Not just a little corner of Tokyo. The entire country fell 87%. Now try to imagine that in Taiwan. Taipei prices down 87%. Pingdong down 87%. Kaohsiung down 87%. Hualien down 87%. Taichung down 87%. What kind of economy do you think that left in Taiwan when all these prices are down 87%? But Japanese GDP never fell below the peak of the bubble. Why? Very simple reason. The government borrowed $100 and spent it. If government borrowed $100, then 900 plus $100,000, there's no reason for GDP to fall. Next year, the same thing happens. Private sector is paying down debt, economy is collapsing, but the government borrowed additional money, put that back into the income stream, and that's what kept the Japanese economy going. So the most important lesson from the Japanese experience is that if you are in this kind of recession, which is a very rare type of recession, happens only after bursting of a nationwide asset price bubble, government has to borrow money to keep the economy going. I don't recommend this under any other circumstances, but when you are in this situation where asset prices collapse, Japanese real estate prices is where it was in 1973. Some of you are not born yet. I mean, it has fallen that bad. When you are in this situation, government has to borrow money. And if you do, the government borrows the money, private sector have the income to pay down debt, and after some years, private sector balance sheets are repaired, then you fix the government balance sheets. But it has to be in that order. So where is Japan now? Is Japan really coming out of all the problems? This chart shows who has been saving money and who has been borrowing money in Japan. The horizontal line at zero, above zero, this area, are the people saving money. Below zero are the people who are borrowing money. And there are four lines here: government line, corporate line, rest of the world, and the households. If you add the four lines together, you're supposed to get zero. That's how these things are put together. But during the bubble days, sure enough, Japanese companies are borrowing huge sum of money, investing in all sorts of assets. And once the bubble burst, you can see this line going up and up and up. Japanese companies became the largest savers in Japan. Households are supposed to save and companies are supposed to borrow. But we had a reverse situation here. Companies are borrowing even more than the households. And then once the balance sheets are repaired, it came down. And then during the Lehman shock, they went up again. And it's still coming down, but not yet below zero. Why is it still above zero when the balance sheets are already clean, repaired? Well, they're still above zero because any private sector companies or even households who go through this experience of repairing balance sheets say to themselves, never again, I never want to borrow money again. Which means they will do everything within their cash flow. They never borrow money. The Americans who lived through the Great Depression never borrow money until they died because the experience was so bad. We have a mini version of that in Japan. I have called a mini version because in the United States, the GDP actually fell 46%. So people have 46% less income to pay down debt. In the Japanese case, then that must have been very, very difficult. Your income is half, but you still have to pay down debt, just like the situation we have in Greece at the moment. in the Japanese case, the GDP never fell below the peak of the bubble. And so they have the income to pay down debt. Still took 15 years, and so they're saying never again. So Abenomics is designed to fix that problem. You don't hear about Abenomics anymore. The market is not that excited about this topic at the moment. But as you know, there are three components to Abenomics. First one is monetary easing. And Bank of Japan did all this monetary easing. A lot of people in Taiwan said, hey, how come if Japanese can do it, how come we can't do it? And there was a lot of excitement here as well. But as you saw earlier, all that pumping of money really did not help the real economy because the money hasn't entered the real economy. So, Bank of Japan tried, but unfortunately it didn't do much good. Secondly, the fiscal stimulus, government borrowing and spending money, is still very, very important in Japan. Most people don't report on this one. They say, oh, it's the same thing all over again. But this is very important because, as you saw earlier, Japanese private sector is still saving 6.6% of GDP at zero interest rates. 6.6% of GDP. Which means the government has to borrow 6% of GDP to keep the economy going. So second arrow is still very important, and I'm glad that it's there. But if the government knows that you cannot do this forever, so they have put in a lot of measures to encourage people to borrow. For example, if you invest in Japan today, you can write off 50% of your investment within the first year. So usually, you can only depreciate over some period of time, but now you can write off the first 50% first year to improve your cash flow. So these are the measures the Japanese government are putting in to get people to borrow money. And once they start borrowing money, then we are back to the textbook world, not the world of what I call balance sheet recession. And then the economy can move forward from there. Now the third one, the structural reform. American journalists love this thing called structural reform. So those of you who get your information on Japan from English sources, this is what they pay most attention to. I have to tell you, structural reform takes very long time to produce results. The person who makes structural reform such a big topic in economics is President Reagan in the United States from 1980 to 1988. He was the president of the United States at that time, and he talked about so-called supply-side reform to get the economy moving. And he changed tax laws drastically. He changed regulations, deregulate the economy drastically. And what happened to the US economy after Reaganomics? Well, most of you have this probably good impression of Reaganomics. Yeah, it made the United States strong again. But how long did it take for Reaganomics to work? Reagan had 2 terms, from 1980 to 1988. And his vice president, George Bush the father, the decent one, he had another 1 term. So altogether there were 12 years of Republican administration. And during that 12 years, Soviet Union collapsed, Cold War ended, and they won the first Gulf War. Fantastic diplomatic achievements. And after the end of the 12 years, President George Bush the father went up for re-election, and he lost his re-election to this young kid from Arkansas by the name of Bill Clinton. And he only had 1 campaign line. The campaign line was, "It's the economy, stupid." And he won. Which means, during the 12 years, US economy was still struggling, still not doing very well. I'm one of those who voted for Reagan in 1980. So I believed in the Reaganomics. I believed that was what the United States needed. It still took that many years. But when when Clinton got elected, US economy began to do very well. Suddenly all these IT companies, Yahoo, Internet, Google, all these other guys start making huge sum of money and easily surpassed Japan again. Those all started in the 1980s with Reagan's supply-side economics. But it took them 15 years to really produce results that people could feel. How many of you can remember economic policy of President Clinton? You might still remember Monica Lewinsky, but not too many people can remember what Clinton did. He did next to nothing. But during his term, the economy was doing so well that by his second term, US government was running budget surplus, huge budget surplus. All because of what Reagan did 15 years earlier. So this structural reform is very important, sometimes absolutely essential, but don't hold your breath thinking that the results will show up tomorrow. This thing is going to take a long time to produce results. I have no doubt in my mind that Prime Minister Abe is serious about structural reform. But for that to actually have a macroeconomic impact, we have to wait many more years, just like it took Reaganomics 15 years to produce that result. But Japan is actually changing dramatically, even without the government doing all the work. How many of you know the name Ariana Miyamoto, or Miyamoto Ariana? Anyone familiar with the name? Well, it's a she, 21 years old, just selected Miss Universe Japan. She is actually black, or to use the American term. Her mother is a US Navy person, Afro-American. So she has a darker skin, a little bit of curly hair. She doesn't look very much like Japanese. But she was actually selected to represent Japan in the Miss Universe pageant. Of course, she went through and suffered huge amount of discrimination when she was growing up in Japan. I know what that is like because I grew up in Japan at that time earlier, and I suffered quite a bit of that myself. But so that's a story in itself, I'm sure, how much she suffered. But what's remarkable about the whole story is that it's the Japanese judges, some very conservative men, actually selected this person to represent Japan. And not just at the one level. You know, when you become Miss Universe Japan, you have to start from a very low level, right? Prefecture level, city level, village level, and then you go to the national level. And this entire process, she was selected by these judges, some of them I'm sure very conservative types. That shows how much Japan is changing. That if the person is great character, can represent the Japanese culture, it doesn't matter how she might have some darker skin and so forth, let her represent Japan. That's the kind of changes that's happening. And so I have quite a bit of hope on these changes in the Japanese society, but for that to have a macroeconomic impact, I'm afraid you have to wait a few more years. Now, the Japanese yen came down quite dramatically, especially after Abenomics. And many in Taiwan are saying, hey, why can't we do the same thing, bring the Taiwan dollar down, and that would be helpful for the Taiwanese economy. Well, I'm sure that would be helpful for the Taiwanese economy, but there's a key difference between Japan and Taiwan on this issue. Japan is now a trade deficit country. In fact, a huge trade deficit country. Whereas Taiwan, thanks to your hard work, is a surplus country. And a very, very healthy surplus country. Now, if you're a deficit country, pushes exchange rates down, nobody complains. Because that's the right thing to do. In fact, I wonder why it took so long for yen to come down. Yen start coming down here, it should have come down here. But some people sleep in the foreign exchange market, so when they woke up and then they suddenly push it down. But in the Taiwanese case, we have a very healthy trade surplus, and some people may complain, some other countries may complain, that hey, you have a trade surplus and you still want to push the exchange rates down, that's no good. So this is one key difference between the Taiwanese situation and the Japanese situation, in that Japan was running a huge trade deficit. But thanks to the lower price of oil and a weaker Japanese yen, the trade deficit is shrinking, and so I don't think yen will start falling very badly from this level onwards. In fact, for those of you who travel to Japan, I'm sure you found out that Japan is very, very cheap. And I actually spent 2 months, April to April, May in Taipei, trying to understand what my father's doing. And I must tell you that Taiwan is quite expensive in many areas compared to Japan. And so Japanese yen is very much undervalued in my view. It may still weaken a little bit because of the differences in monetary policy, but I think the downside risk of Japanese yen is now becoming much less than it used to be. How about the United States? This is the situation in the United States, and you notice that household sector, Americans used to love to borrow money. And during the bubble days, they were significantly below zero. Below zero means the entire US household sector was, instead of saving money, they're actually borrowing money. Where are they now? They are massively saving money at zero interest rates. We used to think that Americans, they just keep on borrowing until the end of the world. Those Americans are gone. We don't have those Americans borrowing money anymore. Actually, Americans are saving money, almost 7% of GDP at zero interest rates. So this is almost like the entire transformation of the American race. Right? They used to borrow money like there's no tomorrow. And now they are saving money massively, even with interest rates of zero. That is why U.S. economy is still not at full strength, even though Fed Chairwoman Janet Yellen is now trying to move interest rates up a little bit. U.S. is not fully out of the what I call balance sheet recession yet, because if you add the two together, corporate sector and the household sector, they're still saving almost 4% of GDP at zero interest rates. But what makes the U.S., why U.S. is doing much better than the rest of the countries, is that within the first 2 years of the Lehman Brothers, Janet Yellen, Ben Bernanke, all those people read my book and realized that, oh my gosh, we have the same problem here. That's the same book that Tai Ching translated, which is why I'm here, because they are the ones who translated, so when they requested me to speak, I cannot say no. It's that book that Bernanke read, Janet Yellen read, Larry Summers read, and they realized that they have the same problem as Japan, which is why they came up with this term, fiscal cliff. I don't know how that was translated to Chinese, but if we fall off the fiscal cliff, we're all dead. That line. Because in a situation like this, where the corporate sector and the household sector combined are saving 5, 6, 7% of GDP at zero interest rates, And if the government refuses to borrow, the whole thing will collapse. And so, along among Western economies, the United States issued a warning. Don't cut the deficit right now. Don't cut the budget deficit right now. And it worked. Although the United States came very close to falling off the fiscal cliff, there was the sequester problem, the debt ceiling arguments, and then there was a government shutdown. U.S. barely stayed away from the fiscal cliff. Now they are doing much better. This shows how much money American households saved, the blue bars, and how much money American households borrowed, the orange bars. And the net line is the same line that you saw here, this red line. During the bubble days, American households are saving money, but they were borrowing even more. So the net line is below zero. But after that, borrowing completely stopped. Not only they completely stopped, orange bars are sometimes above zero. Above zero means the whole US household is actually paying down debt, like the Japanese companies you saw earlier. But recently, some of the balance sheets are becoming much cleaner, repaired. So they are beginning to borrow money a little bit. I mean, starting from a very low base, but they are beginning to borrow, which is why the US economy is doing better than the rest. So I'm really glad that people like Jim Menenke and Larry Summers, we became very good friends afterwards. And so we often exchanged information and insights. But at least among all these economies, US learned from the Japanese experience and avoided the Japanese mistake. How about Europe? There's so many European countries, so this chart shows what the European private sector as a group is doing. So instead of having many lines, I combine the household corporate sector lines into one line. And if they're below zero, that means the entire private sector is borrowing money. If it's above zero, they are actually saving money. And you can see that during the bubble days, many of the private sectors in European countries are significantly below zero. Like Spain, Ireland, where the bubbles are very big, or even Greece. But after the bursting of the bubble, they're all above zero, significantly above zero. And if you look at some of the numbers, Irish private sector is saving 10% of GDP, Spain 6.8, Portugal 6.5, Italy 6.3. It's a huge savings generated in the private sectors of these European economies. Unfortunately, there's a big problem in Europe. And that is that when they joined Euro, they all had to sign this agreement that said the government can never borrow more than 3% of GDP, no matter what happens. But the private sector is saving 10% of GDP. If the government can only borrow 3, what happens to the remaining 7? You can go back and read all that treaty, or Maastricht Treaty, that created the euro. There's not a single line that tells you what to do when the situation like this. The private sector as a group is saving more than 3% of GDP. What should the government do? Because they never thought something like this is going to happen. But it's happening right in front of them since 2008. But because that's the way the rules were written, and the Germans love to follow rules, they're saying everybody else must follow the rules too. And so even though the private sector savings are bigger than their budget deficits, they are all trying to reduce their budget deficits, which means they're all voluntarily falling off the fiscal cliff. And that's the reason, I'm afraid, Europe is doing so poorly. Now, except Greece, and I'll talk about Greece a little later. This is, for example, the Spanish households. Now, if you remember, Spain had a huge bubble. And during the bubble days, sure enough, the line was significantly below zero. Now they're massively above zero, with very little borrowings, even at zero or even negative interest rates. People are not borrowing money. So Spain is in a very serious balance sheet recession, which is why unemployment rate is over 20%, people are struggling. But no one is paying attention to this problem. They're all paying attention to the issue that, hey, the budget deficit is bigger than 3%. You have to reduce it. But whether the budget deficit is good or bad, you should judge against the size of the private sector savings. But nobody's looking at the private sector savings. They're only comparing the 3% against the current budget deficit. But the situation just gets worse and worse and worse. This is Ireland, same story. Huge borrowing during the bubble days, huge savings, no borrowing here at all. Orange bars are above zero. Means everybody in Ireland is paying down debt at negative interest rates. This is Italy, sorry, this is Portugal, same situation. Everybody paying down debt. Italy, same situation, nobody borrowing money, people still paying down debt. So until Europeans understand that they have a very different recession, balance sheet recession, that was never anticipated when they put together the Maastricht Treaty, unless they understand that, I'm afraid Europe will continue to suffer. Now, even Germans are actually in the same boat, except that they were in this situation from 2000 instead of 2008. Germans, like in Taiwan we had that, and Japan and the United States, we had an IT bubble, right, or dot-com bubble. And the Germans went crazy during the dot-com bubble. This is what happened to German NASDAQ, if I may call it. Germans are very serious people. They don't like people who play around in the stock market. They look down on people who play in the stock market. But during that dot-com bubble, Germans went crazy, pushed 1,000 almost to 10,000, and the market collapsed. 97% decline in the entire shares. It got so bad that they changed the name of the market. It used to be called Neumarkt, but now they changed the name to PECDAX. And still it's 1625. After the collapse of this, Germans were so shocked by the collapse that they refused to borrow money at all. And the situation is still with them, even though this is 15 years after the collapse of the German dot-com bubble. So Germany is in balance sheet recession. Everybody else is in balance sheet recession. Nobody's borrowing money. Everybody's saving money, which is why European economies are doing so poorly. Now, how about Greece? This is the Greece situation. Now, if you remember, Greece had a bubble, a housing bubble. So you can see that orange bars are above zero. So Greek people are paying down debt. But you also notice that blue bars are below zero. Now, when blue bars are below zero, we are in a very serious situation. Because blue bars below zero means two things. One, the banks are in such a sad shape that they cannot lend you any money. But because people have borrowed money before, or they need the money to keep the business going, you have to withdraw your savings to keep the business going or to keep feeding your families. So when blue bars go below zero, that's a very bad sign. And in a Greek case, blue bars have been significantly below zero the entire period. So this leads to really the Greek crisis in that this is what happened to Greek GDP. Greek GDP kept on going up before the crisis, and then once the crisis hit, IMF, European Union said, okay, if you do this and this and this and this, that, there will be 2 years of GDP declines, but everything will be great afterwards. So Greek people said, okay, we screwed up. We listened to the IMF. So they did all the structural reforms, cut the deficit, raised taxes, cut spending, they did all of that, thinking that after 2 years, everything will be fine again. But when they did all of that, told by the IMF, the economy actually collapsed. This is what happened to the economy. And because the economy collapsed, people are so poor, they cannot survive without withdrawing savings from the past, which is why we see blue lines below zero. So the private sector in Spain is not only not saving money, it's actually dissaving to survive. So a situation like this country can never pay the debt back to the foreigners, because to pay debt back to the foreigners, someone in Greece has to be saving money. But the entire Greece private sector is actually dissaving because they cannot survive without doing this. So in that sense, this European EU telling the Greek people that just do this, so you can pay us back. Well, the more they do, the worse the situation gets. I happen to know Finance Minister Varoufakis of the Greek government, who just resigned